Everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're here to welcome you to Everyday People, Everyday Needs, Fair Housing for Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Clients. This webinar is being presented concurrently in Zoom and in YouTube. If you registered through Ramco and are viewing this webinar, you will receive CE. If you have any technical support needs, please feel free to use the tech helpline, or you can call our office. If you have any follow-up questions, you can email us at education@oregonrealtors.org. Today, we have the honor of being joined by Percy Wise, Senior Loan Officer with Two River Mortgage, an independent mortgage brokerage firm based in Portland. As a non-practicing attorney, Percy is well-versed in issues of public interest law, including fair housing, LGBT rights, and racial justice. He is an experienced local loan officer who's licensed in both Washington and Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Percy today. Thank you, Percy.
Thank you so much, Erica. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to start my slide deck here. I have this wonderful new background. I think it was by Bear Paints, but I figured it was very real estate and design friendly. But you won't be seeing my my photo for most of this. I'm going to have my slideshow here. So here we go. Like Erica said, today's training is entitled Everyday People, Everyday Needs, Fair Housing for Transgender and Gender Nonconforming Clients. A little bit more about me. I'm a senior loan officer with Two Rivers Mortgage. I'm also a graduate of Lewis and Clark Law School here in Portland. I am a non-practicing attorney, a member of the Oregon State Bar. I'm the outgoing treasurer for the diversity section of the bar. I'm also a board member of the LGBT Law Association of Oregon. I'm a co-founder of the Oregon Transgender Law Caucus. It's a group of transgender attorneys here in Oregon. And I have been a mortgage loan officer since 2017. Absolutely love this job. I love working with my clients. Market, what a crazy time for our market, right? I have, some clients want to bid on houses that don't even have heat furnaces because the market is so competitive out there. We've been really lucky this year with the amount of business that we've had. Okay, so I live on a floating home, not quite real property. I love to kayak. I went out Sunday in the rain, kayaked for 5 miles. I do yoga, and I also love jazz. So that's just a little bit about me. You're welcome to contact me anytime after the training if you have questions, whether it's related to working with trans or LGBT folks or just regular old mortgage questions. What are we going to go over today? We are going to go over transgender and non-binary concepts and terminology. We're going to start with the basics, and then we're going to really go deeper into some more advanced concepts and learn more about fair housing law, what's going on with the LGBT community in terms of home buying. We will then go over inclusive practices that you can use in your real estate brokerages. And everything that we learned today is going to help you, whether it's for yourself or whether it is for your clients. It will help you working with your colleagues, your friends, your family. So it's really going to be an all-over training here today. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over the basics of transgender terminology. Some of you might be familiar with this already. That's great. And you might think, well, this is really basic. I just ask you to stay with us because we're going to dive deeper after this. And if this is new to you, that's perfectly great as well. You're welcome to put questions into the chat. Erica's going to help me. We'll have 2 breaks, and I'll take a couple of questions as much as we have time for. And then if you have more questions, or if you just don't want to ask the questions in public, that's fine. You can contact me after the training, and Erica can pass questions to me after the training. Okay, so first of all, people often see this acronym LGBTQ. Sometimes people feel embarrassed if they don't know what this means. It simply stands for the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and sometimes questioning. So questioning is when people are not sure what their gender identity or their sexual orientation is. Our training is mostly going to focus on here, on transgender people. Okay, so what does the word transgender mean? It is an umbrella term. It's referring to people whose gender identity or the way that they express themselves, the gender expression, differs from what is typically associated with the sex they were assigned at birth. Wow, so that's kind of a mouthful. Sex you were assigned at birth, what does that mean? It simply means, baby comes out, doctor says, or the midwife says, it's a girl, it's a boy, or this is an intersex baby. It doesn't quite fit within the normal boxes of sex. And so congratulations, you have a healthy baby. So that's the sex that you're assigned at birth. And then of course, a lot of people don't necessarily grow up to still feel that that sex conforms with who they really are inside, how they really identify. So that's what the term transgender is referring to. In terms of how many people in the United States, how many transgender people there are, the estimate is that there are at least 0.3 to 0.5% of the population in the United States are transgender. So that's at least 1.4 plus million people in the United States. So that's a lot of folks who are transgender in our country. And it means we have a lot of people here in Oregon, all throughout our state, who identify as transgender. Here's another term you may or may not have heard, cisgender. Sometimes this term feels so unfamiliar to people. They might think that it's a slur. It sounds a little bit funny. Cisgender, this simply means a person whose gender identity is consistent with the one they were assigned at birth. So, baby comes out, it's a girl, it's a boy. That person grows up, they still feel like they are a girl or a boy. Where does the term come from? It comes from a Latin prefix that simply means on the same side as, meaning you identify on the same side that you did when you were born. And so if somebody says, hi, I'm cisgender, or are you cisgender? That's just a respectful way of asking whether your gender identity is consistent at birth. It's kind of just a way of saying that you're not transgender. Okay, the next term is transition. This term is referring to the process. So it's a process that a person goes through when they are changing from living in one gender identity to living in another gender identity. So examples of how we would use this would be, she is going through a gender transition right now. Okay, that's one way. Or you could be talking about somebody's past. When did you transition? When did he transition? He transitioned when he was 17 years old. So it's important to realize that the steps that a person takes when they're making a gender transition are individual. They're going to differ from person to person depending on each person's needs. So not everybody needs to do the same thing. They don't necessarily need to have the same hormones or the same clothing choices or the same choices about medical care or psychological care. It's really individual to what each person needs. So let's talk about terms that we use to refer to transgender people. We're going to talk about binaries first. We're going to talk about women and men, and then we're going to talk about non-binary people. So first, we have transgender women. People often get hung up, and this is, if you remember one thing from this training, if this is new to you, this is going to be probably the most important and impactful thing that you can remember. People often get hung up when you're talking about transgender people. They try to import the birth gender back from the trans person's past. They try to hold on to that birth gender and bring it into their post-transition life. So a lot of times people are referring to transgender women, but they want to somehow remember that that person was born male. And so they want to somehow import that male identity. And so that's the thing that you do not ever want to do. You always want to use the terms that reflect the way that a person identifies now, right? So a transgender woman is somebody who was born or assigned male at birth, and they go through transition to become female. This person is a woman, can be referred to as simply a woman, may be referred to as a trans woman or a transgender woman. And sometimes people are particular about how they would prefer to be referred to. So you want to be sensitive to how each person identifies. So this person made a gender transition, and remember, they are socially and physically a real woman. Here is a person on the left. She's a real person and a real woman. Her name is Mia Yamamoto. She is a transgender woman. She lives in Los Angeles. She is a Japanese American attorney who was born in Poston Relocation Camp in Arizona in 1943. And Mia is an amazing woman. I really encourage you, if you have a chance, there's a video link at the bottom here. You can just Google her too. Google The Lavender Effect and Mia Yamamoto. You can watch a wonderful 5-minute video of her life. She, I believe she may be retired now, but she was one of the leading criminal defense attorneys in the Los Angeles area for many years. And her story just all the way around is an incredible story. So I encourage you to look into her life history a little bit more. Okay, then we have the category of men. So we have transgender men. These are people who are born female and they become male. So I don't know if I mentioned, but I'm transgender. So I'm a transgender man as well. Transgender men may be referred to as men. That's a man. This is a trans man. That's a transgender man. And it's a person who made a gender transition socially and or physically to become a real man. So it's pretty much that simple, is that you just want to always remember to refer to people in the gender that they are living in now. This is a picture of Kyler Brodus on the left. He is an African-American transgender attorney. Kyler was the first transgender man to testify in front of Congress, in front of the United States Congress. Okay, let's move on. We're going to talk about people who are gender nonconforming, non-binary people. This is becoming very popular. Excuse me. Non-binary identification is becoming much more well-known in the past few years than it was before, because more options have been developed for people. And it's really important that people have options to live how they feel, their internal truths. So what does it mean to be gender non-conforming or non-binary? These terms recognize that gender can be on a spectrum. So not everybody, here's a binary, male and female. Not everybody identifies all the time as male or all the time as female. Some people identify as a mix. Some people do not align themselves with one identity or another. People who identify as non-binary, gender non-conforming, may also identify as gender neutral, gender fluid. They may identify as gender queer, or as a combination of different genders. Non-binary people may or may not transition physically through the use of medication or surgeries. And again, just remember, like I said before, transition and identity is really up to the person and that individual person's needs. So non-binary people can have surgeries and take hormones or not, depending on what their needs are. Legal recognition. So we think of non-binary as something that's sort of new. This is real. This is legally recognized in at least 18 jurisdictions in the United States. Non-binary identity is recognized all throughout the world now. Many different countries have legal recognition where you can identify as non-binary on your country's passport. And here in the United States, all of these different states have legal recognition for non-binary gender. This is a third category of gender. So you look at this list, they're not always the states that you would expect. This is not necessarily a red, blue, liberal, conservative thing. So it's Arkansas, California, Colorado, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Minnesota, on, Virginia. All of these states now, you can go and change your gender to be non-binary. And you, on your driver's license, your ID card for that state, instead of having an M or an F, you can have an X. So here's a photo. I got this off of Wikipedia. So whoever this is decided to put this on Wikipedia. This is a driver's license from New Mexico, and it's simply showing that this person named Arlo, they are identifying as non-binary. So you see here their sex is X. Okay, so let's talk about the fact that I just called Arlo they. Pronouns, how do we refer to people? We often say he, him, she, her. Now we say they, them when we're talking about non-binary folks. So another key takeaway, just like I said, you never want to try to re-import the birth gender into a person's current life. You want to always use the gender pronouns that a person currently uses. You do not want to use pronouns for a birth gender. And so that means if somebody's identifying as a woman, if they use female pronouns, those are the pronouns that you want to use for that woman. If you meet somebody, a common question is, what do? I meet somebody, I don't know. I don't know what their pronouns are. And it doesn't necessarily depend on what the person looks like. It doesn't depend on whether they look trans or whether they look cisgender. You don't always know what people's pronouns are. So a lot of people are developing a practice of asking at the beginning of meetings, can you go tell us your name and your pronouns? Or maybe putting your pronouns in other places where people can find them, or displaying your pronouns so that people know what your pronouns are. If you do not know, does this person go by he? Does this person go by she? Do they go by they? Just ask nicely. You don't want to make a big thing of it. You don't want to be kind of pointing somebody out saying, I don't know what pronouns to use for you. But you can just ask that person nicely. If you can't ask them, you can use they pronouns until you learn otherwise. You can use the person's name until you know what the pronouns are. Or you can start with the pronoun that matches the person's appearance until you are corrected. So these are acceptable, respectful ways of using pronouns. So here's a way that you can ask respectfully. You can start by saying, like, pretend this is me. You could say, my name is Percy. My pronouns are he and him. May I ask which pronouns you use? Okay, so that's respectful because you're also disclosing something about yourself. In our real estate context, maybe you're working and showing homes and you happen upon a seller or a buyer and you're not sure what pronouns the other realtor's clients use. So you could say, hi, other realtor. I want to be respectful of your client. May I ask what pronouns your client uses? It's just a simple way of showing respect. If you don't know, like I said, what the pronouns are, you can use the person's name. You can just insert the name instead of where you would normally have he or him, she or her. So you could say something like, hey, I was expecting to meet Monica here. Do you know when Monica will arrive? So that's a way of saying that instead of saying, do you know when she or he will arrive? And here's the most important part. When you get the answer, when somebody tells you, please call me she, when somebody tells you, please call me they, you have to trust that person's answer and stick with it no matter what, because they know what they're talking about. They know who they are. Try not to get hung up on your own perceptions or opinions. You never know. Somebody might be just at the beginning of a gender transition They may look female, but maybe they're really male. And they're telling you, please use he and him. And before you know it, you're going to look at them someday and you're going to see a man and you're going to understand. You're going to understand why they told you that. So try not to get hung up on your own perceptions of them. And you also want to expect to use they, them, their when referring to one person. Those are the commonly accepted pronouns for non-binary people, using they, them, and their. So what do I do? What do I do if this is unfamiliar to me? What do I do if I'm having trouble? What do I do if, and I'm just going to be really honest here. I am a little bit older. I come from a time when I made my gender transition. We didn't have non-binary identity in culture. We didn't have they, them pronouns. So for a while there, I struggled, even though I'm transgender, I struggled with using they and them pronouns for people because it was just a new concept for me. And so if you're in this boat, I will just tell you, practice makes perfect. It really does. My cousin contacted me, a distant cousin contacted me recently and said, you know, my kid is identifying as non-binary. And they are now going by they, them pronouns instead of she, her pronouns. And I'm really struggling. I really don't want to do. I want to respect my child, but I'm having a hard time. And so the advice that I give to my cousin is the same advice I will give to all of you, which is just practice. Here's a way that we can practice right now. We can look at two people and simply practice using their pronouns in a sentence. So the person on the left, her name is Rafi Friedman Gerspan. In 2016, Rafi Friedman Gerspan was appointed by President Obama as the primary LGBT liaison for the White House. She was the first transgender person in the role. Her work currently focuses on ending electoral gerrymandering. So that's just an example of talking about a transgender person using their correct pronouns. Here's another person on the right. This is Tyler Ford. Tyler identifies as non-binary. They are a writer, editor, performer, and LGBTQ+ advocate. I saw them in the New York Times Magazine. Their poetry is well known. So just an example of practicing using non-binary pronouns. Sometimes with the they, them, their pronouns, you hear a lot of pushback about, well, that's not grammatically correct. Don't get hung up on that. We have actually found that there are a lot of usages of they, them, their pronouns for individuals, including in the poetry of Emily Dickinson. So it doesn't really get any more American than that to use they, them pronouns. Okay, this is wrapping up the beginning of the basic transgender terminology and concept section. Erica, do we have any main questions coming through?
The main question that we got a couple of times was asking about they as singular versus they as plural. And as a queer grammar nerd, I'm happy to also speak to that. So
yeah, go for it.
All right. So one of the great things about the term there's actually a long history, as Percy was just saying, of using they in the singular. And we often, when we talk about a baby, pardon my dog, that we don't know before they're born, we will use they. So there is a long history of using they, and then APA recently came out and stated that they are formally recognizing they as a singular as well. So there's a couple different layers of they has historically been used singular and also is now currently recognized as singular as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. It's great to have somebody else who can chime in, another expert who can chime in on the training. So, I just want to end this section with my advice to you. Like I said, if you're struggling with pronouns, practice, but you don't want to practice with transgender people because that's harmful to us. It's hurtful to us. Imagine if you woke up, imagine if you're female and you identify as a woman, and every day when you go out to the coffee shop, the barista is calling you he and him. Imagine how hurtful that would be. And so you don't want to practice with trans people. Find a buddy. Find a buddy that you can practice with. Maybe it's your partner, your spouse, your colleague. Say, oh, I have a new client who's non-binary, and I'm just worried about the they, them pronouns. Just practice talking about that person. As you can role play. If you don't have a buddy, just look in the mirror, or you could just walk around your house and practice, pretend you're talking to that person using their pronouns, and you'll get it. I promise you will get it if you do that. Okay, so let's talk about transgender demographics. I'm going to talk about experiences that transgender people in the United States have. And I'm going to use a survey that was conducted. It was conducted in 2015, but it came out in 2017. It's called the United States Transgender Survey. And it was an incredible population and demographic survey across the board for any demographic survey. It's an amazing study because they interviewed over 28,000 transgender people in the United States. Not a lot of population surveys have that kind of breadth or that type of rigor to them. So let's talk about what transgender people experience in the United States. Unfortunately, many transgender people are treated very poorly on a regular basis. As a result, transgender people may take longer to develop trust with you when they're working with you. In a few minutes, we'll go over things you can do to build trust with your trans clients. So let's just take a look at the left here. Experiences within the last year when the study was conducted. 46% of respondents to this survey said they had been verbally harassed within the last year. Not very good. When we look at economic hardship, keep in mind, I'm pulling out slides that are specific to our industry, specific to real estate, because that's what we're here for. Economic hardship. When we look at homeownership rates in this country, the estimate is that we have a really great high homeownership rate in our country. 63% of people in the United States own their home. That's the general population. But when the transgender people were surveyed, only 16% own their home. So that's a huge difference in the homeownership rate. When we look at housing, what are transgender people's experiences? Just anecdotally, I have experiences being discriminated against because I was trans or LGBT with housing. I've been denied apartments in my life. I mean, look at me. I've been denied apartments because of my LGBT status, even in San Francisco. So housing discrimination is unfortunately very real for transgender people. When the survey was conducted, 23% of the respondents said they had experienced some form of housing discrimination in the past year. So what does it mean? It means that on average, once every 4 or 5 years, somebody would experience housing discrimination. That's very serious. What would it be like in a difficult rental market? What would it be like for you if you're looking for an apartment, you finally find the apartment, and the landlord reaches out and said, I'm sorry, I'm not going to rent this to you? It would be devastating. So those are the experiences. When we look at identity documents, we just saw that great driver's license from New Mexico. Well, many transgender people are not able to update their state identification. Why is that? There are legal and financial barriers. Sometimes it costs money to update your ID. Sometimes there are difficult legal processes that people have to engage in. They don't quite know how to get court documents filed. They don't know how to access legal services. The services aren't available. And so when the survey was conducted, they found that only 29% of transgender people who had already transitioned had been able to update their gender on their driver's license. So imagine if you are walking around with, every time you present your driver's license, it has the wrong gender on it. That would be really difficult. Only 44% of the people had been able to update their name. So imagine if your name is Judy, But every time you have to present your ID, let's say you're pulled over and it says James on it, it's very difficult for people. So something to keep in mind in your real estate practices is that if people have not updated their legal identity, if they're buying a home, they're going to have their legal name on that contract, right? And so, but try not to get too hung up about that with your client, because transgender people are used to having a legal identity and a personal identity in many times. So you might need to put James on the real estate contract, even if your client identifies as Judy. If you have time, if you're working with a client and you know, okay, Judy, you're planning on buying this house, but you're not going to buy it for like another 3 to 6 months or a year. And if Judy hasn't been able to update her identity documents, you might be able to help her with that. You might be able to refer her to an attorney who can help her get her ID changed over so that when she does buy the house, she can take title in her real name, Judy. So keep that in mind. Okay, so that's just the basics of what transgender people are going through in the United States from a real estate perspective. And again, if you are curious about that, you want to learn more about that, I really encourage you to just Google US transgender survey and take a look at more of what people are going through. There's actually a breakout for Oregon. There are many breakouts for different states. There's also breakouts for African-American people, Native American people, so you can really dive into that. Okay, so you can see from the demographic info that transgender and non-binary folks need to be protected from housing discrimination. Let's take a look at where those protections come from. I'm hoping we all know this. State law, Oregon and Washington prohibits LGBT housing discrimination. You cannot discriminate against LGBT people, transgender or non-binary people in rentals or home sales. Basic stuff, right? Okay, but what about the federal law? What about the Federal Fair Housing Act? Does that also protect LGBT people? The answer is yes. This was a point of contention and argument and court battles over many years. Even just last year, I had a number of slides. There are many cases at the highest courts, different United States Courts of Appeals saying, hey, if a lesbian couple comes to a retirement community, can the retirement community turn them away just because they're a lesbian couple? And so there was a really spotty landscape of whether the answer was yes or no, whether people could or could not discriminate under the Fair Housing Act. Well, last year we had a case, actually just this June, Bostock versus Clayton County. This is a case where trans and LGBT people brought employment discrimination suits because they had been fired from their jobs just because they were LGBT. And the Supreme Court said that the term in the statute of Title VII includes, that the term because of sex includes LGBT people. And that meant under Bostock, the case, that you cannot discriminate in employment because somebody is LGBT. But it did something much more important because many, many federal statutes use the term because of sex. And the Bostock case means that, that any of those statutes that are federal statutes using because of sex applies to LGBT individuals. Legally, it should fall that housing, lending, employment, healthcare, sports, all of those areas, federal anti-discrimination statutes provide protection for LGBT people. That means that the Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination in home sales and rentals because of sex throughout the whole United States. During the current administration, there was a time period where there had been some guidance issued about housing discrimination on the HUD website. The guidance had been given during the prior administration and it was removed during the current administration. If you looked at the HUD website, even last year, you would just find a blank where there had been information about LGBT housing discrimination. After Bostock, if you look at the HUD website, it has been re-updated. So this is actually a snapshot. The link is at the bottom here, but this slide is actually a snapshot from the actual HUD website. And it says, people who identify as LGBT who've experienced housing discrimination may be able to pursue a claim under some or all of the following. The Fair Housing Act. Okay, so they're acknowledging that the Fair Housing Act prohibits LGBT housing discrimination. There's also a HUD equal access rule, and there's the state and local anti-discrimination laws that we talked about. So here's the second part of the slide on HUD. What is the HUD equal access rule? It requires, I'm just going to read this, it requires equal access to HUD programs without regard to a person's actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity, or marital status. So housing providers that receive HUD funding or have HUD insured loans are subject to these rules. So it means that people who identify as LGBT, if they've experienced or feel like they are in the process of experiencing housing discrimination by a HUD funded or a FHA insured housing provider, they can file a report, a complaint with HUD by contacting the local FHEO office. So what does this mean? It means I'm a mortgage lender. I lend on FHA loans, right? And so if a gay couple comes to me and I discriminate against them because they're gay and don't give them an FHA loan, they can go file a complaint with HUD at the local office. So this is very important. LGBT people are covered. We are covered against housing discrimination. Okay, so we're going to move on. Let me catch up on my notes here. So let's think about the fact that these new protections are kind of new, and they are occurring in the context we're just looking at with the survey of decades and years of past discrimination, people suffering and experiencing discrimination, being turned away in different contexts of their lives. Do you think that people who have experienced those things might be hesitant to buy homes if they have experienced being discriminated against in housing? Okay. Would you be hesitant if you have been discriminated against if you didn't know how a landlord was going to treat you, how a realtor was going to treat you, how a mortgage lender was going to treat you? Might there be some hesitance there to buying a home? So Freddie Mac conducted a study in 2018 to find out what's going on with LGBT people in home buying. And this study was so mind-blowing to me when I saw it, because it just brings so much to light. So Freddie Mac, in their own study, determined that there was a LGBT homeownership disparity. When they did their study, for some reason, they chose to use this term gender expansive instead of transgender or gender nonconforming. So they kind of went off the grid a little bit. But when you look at the study, gender expansive, they're talking about transgender people and non-binary people. What did they find out? What did they find out in terms of home ownership? As we said, US general population has a home ownership rate of about 63%. Freddie Mac said that it was 64%. We have a lot of stereotypes too, right? We have a big stereotype that gay men, because they're two male income earner households, that they have more money than everybody else. It's a big stereotype. Think of, I don't know if you're watching the show Schitt's Creek, but think about the character Daniel, right? The character Daniel, he's just exuding wealth. Like everything has to be designer this and designer that, and he's kind of fallen from grace because of his family circumstances. It's a stereotype. Okay, what the study found is that gay men and lesbians have a lower homeownership rate than people who are not LGBT, than the general population. Gay men actually have a 52% homeownership rate compared with the 64% of the general population. Same for lesbians. For some reason, bisexual people had an even lower homeownership rate, 48%. And this study found that the homeownership rate for transgender people was 33%. So again, it's half the general population. But you look at the survey, what was the survey sample? That's what's at the bottom here. This is how many people they interviewed in each category. So remember, the US Trans survey that I was just talking about, they interviewed 28,000 transgender people. Their survey interviewed 366. So I'm guessing that the US Transgender survey is probably more accurate because it has a broader sample size. So homeownership rate for trans people somewhere between 16 and 33%. Okay, so Freddie Mac said, well, why is this happening? Why is the homeownership rate lower? There are barriers. They identified three main barriers to homeownership for transgender and LGBT people. One was mobility. If you grow up in a town where you're being discriminated against, you have to leave, right? A lot of transgender people leave their hometown so that they go somewhere that's safe. I grew up in a rural area of New Jersey. When I got done with high school, I had to leave. I didn't think I was going to be able to survive in my hometown. So I came out to the West Coast. So that meant I never bought a house in New Jersey, right? So they're saying mobility is a barrier to home ownership. In their survey, they asked people, do you live in the same location now as where you went to high school? Only 32% of LGBT people said yes. 67% said no, I live in a different location, I left. Other people said it's hard to answer. So what does that mean for us? I believe that the opposite is true here in Portland, in the Vancouver, Portland metro area. People come here because they want to be safe. They want to feel safe. And so what would you do if you suddenly get to a place where now you feel safe? My instinct is I'm going to buy a house here. Like I don't want to be forced out by rent increases. I want to buy a home here. So that, I think that really bodes well to LGBT people buying homes in our area. If you're in a more rural place, obviously this mobility is coming into play. I don't want to assume everybody on this call is from the metro area. That's incorrect. But if people are in areas that are more LGBT friendly, I think it's a indicator they're going to be more likely to buy homes. So we have a great opportunity to help people here. That's what I believe. Okay, what's the other barrier? People are overestimating what it takes to buy houses. We know this to be true in our practices, right? People overestimate what they need for their down payment. I see this all the time. But specifically with the LGBT community, this survey found out that when people were asked, what has prevented you from owning a home? 70% of the people said, I do not have enough money for a down payment. Okay, but then they asked the follow-up question, okay, so you don't have enough for a down payment. How much do you need? If you purchased a house today, what % down payment do you need? People didn't know the answer. 30% of the people had no idea. Pretty much everybody got it wrong. The red circle, that's the % of people that got it right. Only 15% of the people got it right. 30% of the people thought they needed between 6 and 19%. 25% of the people thought they needed over 25% down payment. So we need to do a better job, folks. We need to do a better job of getting the word out that you can buy a home, first-time home buyer, with only 3%. Most of the time you only need 5%. FHA loans, you need 3.5%. Sometimes some markets maybe only need 1% down payment. So let's try to get the word out for folks. The down payment's not as much. You might be able to buy a home. The story I love to tell is about a couple of my trans clients. I was on Facebook one afternoon, cruising around, just looking at people's comments. And I saw some transgender friends of mine, they posted on Facebook, hey, sorry, I got the wrong slide going here. Hey, they said, we need to find a new apartment to rent. Anybody have an apartment that we can rent? We need to move. Or they said, maybe in some crazy universe, someday we'd be able to buy a home. And I know these people, I know what they do. I know that they both work, they're both professionals. So I reached out to them on Messenger, and I just said, hey, I'm a mortgage broker. You want to explore whether you can buy a home or not? Let's just talk. And they said that, there's no way we're going to be able to buy a home. We don't have any money. And, I talked to them, and they did have money, and they did have jobs, and they did have income. And we had them in a home about 3 months later. Okay, so we just need to do a better job of outreach. But how can we do that when people are afraid of being discriminated against? 69% of transgender people fear discrimination in the home buying process. That's a lot. That means that they're afraid of us. They're afraid to come to us. They're afraid to talk to us. They're afraid to walk through the door, especially with lenders. Lenders do not have a good reputation in this country. People are afraid to talk to us. So we need to do things so that clients feel more comfortable coming to us. 90% of transgender people said they feared discrimination in the home buying process. Okay, why are we afraid? Why are transgender people afraid? All the news that we see is bad. Lots of trans people are being murdered. The current presidential administration was constantly trying to undo our civil rights. They're trying to take away our housing rights, healthcare, immigration. And we hear our friends report stories of discrimination constantly. People are telling us, hey, look what I went through. So we become afraid. So that's where we're going to transition to talk about inclusive practices. Let's talk about how we can be more inclusive. How can we serve our transgender and non-binary clients and our LGBT clients as well? Well, first of all, we need to expect and be ready to work with transgender people. I don't care where you are. I don't care what your real estate practice is like. You are going to work with a trans person at some point in your career. We need to avoid saying the wrong things. We need to be savvy and competent. We can make our practices affirmatively more friendly. We can support trans and LGBT causes and nonprofits. We can get out in the community and support the community. And we can keep educating ourselves. I'm transgender. I have to keep educating myself too all the time because young people are doing things differently. Some people are doing things differently. I have to keep educating myself. What can you expect? You can expect to work with amazing transgender clients. These are all pictures of transgender people, real transgender people, community organizers, female engineers, chefs, teachers, steelworkers, professors, athletes, authors, therapists. Expect to have an amazing trans client. And what you're going to see when you look at this slide is, wow, I never would have guessed that some of these people are transgender. You're right. You're not going to know all the time if somebody is transgender. You might have already had a transgender client and not even know it, right? Because people aren't always going to tell you that they're trans, but they're going to pick up on things, right? They're going to be looking for signs that they can work with you, that you're friendly, that you're not going to discriminate against them, that you're going to serve them well. What should you not say? I'm not going to say any of these things. All of these terms are outdated and very offensive. So you never want to use any of these terms. If you hear somebody using these terms, you can just say, hey, that's not okay with me. That's an outdated term. It's offensive. Please don't use it around me. You can offer appropriate corrections, whether it's to your friends, family, or in your practice, your staff, other real estate professionals. We're all in this together. What shouldn't you ask? You want to, a lot of times people want to be, they want to appear friendly to trans folks. They want to ask us questions. You want to ask transgender people questions about their trans status. as a way of getting to know them, and a lot of times coming from a place of very good intention, right? You're not trying to discriminate, you're just trying to be friendly. But there's some things that you should not do. You should never ask a transgender person what their old name is. What was your old name? You should never say real name, because the current name is the real name. You don't want to ask somebody what their birth name was. Why? That previous name is private. It's likely not relevant to anything. It's like water under the bridge. Okay. The only time you might ask for that is if you have a real need to know, like the example I had before, maybe the person's ID doesn't match what their current identity is. You might need to say, hey, I just need your legal name for this contract. Okay. But other than that, you're going to use the name that they go by. If this question pops into your brain and you find yourself thinking like, I'm going to ask this person, I just want to know, like, what was your name before? I want you to just take a minute and stop and think in your head, you know, my curiosity is not enough. My curiosity is not enough. Just don't ask. What else shouldn't you ask? You shouldn't ask about somebody's medical experience. People ask these questions all the time to trans folks. They are not appropriate. Do you take hormones? When did you start hormones? Have you had the surgery? Oh, what did you do to transition? What steps did you take? These are violations of privacy. Not only the violations of privacy, you're not going to sound smart. You're not going to sound smart if you ask these questions, because a lot of times they're meaningless questions. People think there might be one surgery. There's many different types of surgeries or medical treatments that a transgender person could have or not have. So if you said, have you had the surgery? It's meaningless. You're not really talking about anything. And if this is coming up, you're thinking, I really want to ask this, just think, would I normally ask somebody what the private parts of their body look like? Would you normally do that? No. You would never do that, right? But for some reason, a trans person, suddenly you want to know. And it's like, you don't need to know, okay? Think, would I usually ask what medications a person is taking? If you normally would you usually ask a client, like, hey client, what medications are you taking? Like, no, that's not relevant. And so you're not going to ask transgender people whether they're on hormones or not, okay? So just basic etiquette. Okay, now what happens? You tried your best and you messed it up. You made a mistake. Okay, what to do when you make a mistake? Try not to make the mistake about you. Try not to go on and on. I'm so sorry. Oh my God, I can't believe I did that. What can I do? You know, try not to do that. Try not to make it about you. Just quickly correct yourself. Make a very brief apology, move on, then go home. And like I said, practice. Just go home and practice. Let's say your client goes by she, all of a sudden you're out and about and maybe you're getting a coffee and you say, oh, he'll have this. Okay, so what happened? You used the wrong pronoun for your client. You misgendered them. You mistakenly called them the wrong gender. Just say, I'm so sorry, I meant to say she, and then you move on. That's it. That's all you have to do. So this actually happened to me. This happened to me a few months ago. I was working with a client. I had known this client in my personal life. They previously had gone by he and him pronouns. And then they came out and they said, hey, I'm actually non-binary. I'm going to go by they, them pronouns from now on. And I knew this, but in my mind, I was still kind of associating them with the he, him pronouns. And so I started, you know, I'm in the transaction, I'm emailing that. I've done a great job training my escrow officers about trans stuff and pronouns and this whole training. My escrow team has had this training. So I'm emailing my escrow officer, he, Mr. And then all of a sudden, like right before closing, when they were about to go in for signing, I realized, oh my goodness, I have been misgendering my client this whole transaction. And I just felt awful. But here's what you do. I wrote an email and I just said, dear escrow officer, hey, yesterday, I realize I have been mistakenly referring to my client as he and him and as Mr. Jones. I apologize for the error. Jay, this is not the real name, but Jay goes by they, them pronouns. Jay would like to schedule their signing for Monday the 22nd. Okay, so I just corrected, and now the escrow agent knows, okay, this person goes by they, them. That's all you need to do. Quickly correct and move on. Okay, so here's my suggestions for inclusive practices. How can you show that you're trans inclusive? How can you show that when trans people come to you, there's just some little signs that they're not going to be discriminated against? One, you can add your pronouns to your signature line. This is my signature line. Normally is not highlighted, obviously, but it's got my name and it says my pronouns are he, him, and his. Okay, you can add that. You can leave a sign somewhere in your office, maybe on your car. You can leave a sign. This is a rainbow flag that is also trans inclusive and racial justice inclusive. Here's the thing though, don't just start sticking signs all over the place if you don't really know how to be inclusive. If you're not really going to do the work of being inclusive, don't just do a bunch of marketing. But when you are, if you are really inclusive, feel free, let people know. It's safe for you to walk in the store. If you don't want to put a rainbow sign on your door, you could also put up a more generic sign, or if you want to be more inclusive to more people for racial justice, other forms of justice, you could add a sign that says something like hate has no place here, or something like that. It just lets people know what the tone of your office is. Bathrooms. If you have a single stall bathroom, you need to convert it immediately to a gender neutral bathroom. I'm not even joking. You need to have a bathroom that people can walk into without regard to gender. It doesn't have to be expensive. Just you can get this sign online for $15.95. This is an all gender restroom. Don't worry about all this stuff people worry about, like some people are messier than others. I just don't even think that that's really a thing. Okay, so be careful though. Some people love these kind of whatever jokey signs. I love some of them. I think some of them are, I like, for instance, there's this one on the right. It's a person in a female dress, person in a male dress, and then person with kind of a swishy skirt. I love this, but some people feel really offended by it. They feel like it's making light of their condition and their identity as trans people. So just you might try to stay a little bit on the safer side. Here's another alternative. Like I just said, hey, if you have a single stall bathroom, you need to convert it right away. You might not be able to do that. You might be in a building that doesn't allow that. You might have the architectural resources to do that. So here's another way that you could hint to people that they are welcome. This is a sign from the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. It says, hey, this is the women's room, but it's for self-identified. That's telling all trans women in the world, hey, you're welcome here. If you're a trans woman, you're welcome in this bathroom. You don't have to worry about coming in here. Okay, obviously we're in COVID. We're not really, we're not frequently meeting our clients out in the world for coffee and restaurants and stuff, fun stuff like that, like we like to do. I love to meet my clients in bars and coffee shops instead of in a boring old mortgage office. If you're able to meet with your clients, try to give your client their choice. Where do you want to meet? Because they're going to know which places feel comfortable for them, where they feel safe. They might have their list of favorite places. That's a good way to score points for your clients. A better way to score points with your clients is find options near you that have gender neutral bathrooms, right? If you're going to meet in a cafe or a restaurant or a bar, you do the work. Then invite your client there. They will notice. They might not ever mention it to you, but they are going to notice, hey, this is a place where I feel comfortable. I really feel comfortable with my realtor. Also a great way to show off a neighborhood, obviously. You guys know that already. Be an advocate for your client. Always follow, remember, you always follow your client's lead. You don't want to ever out your client. You don't ever want to tell anybody that your client is transgender. That's their personal business. But what happens if the inspector comes and uses the wrong pronouns for your client? That might feel really uncomfortable. So you might want to have that conversation in advance. Like if you know that your client is transgender, you might just want to say to them, hey, I do my best to work with transgender competent professionals, inspectors, contractors. But if anything ever happens, if anybody ever uses the wrong pronoun for you, what would you like me to do? Do you want me to address that for you? Follow your client's lead. You could say to your client, my usual response if somebody misgenders my client is to correct them. Would you prefer that I do that, or is that something you want to do? Another time this comes up, following the client's lead, I had a client call me. They wanted to buy a house with their father, but they didn't want the father to know that they were transgender, right? So the father is looking at my client as if it's their daughter, but the client is telling me that they are really non-binary identified. So following my client's lead, I said, what would you prefer? Do you prefer that I just call you she throughout this whole transaction so that I don't make a mistake with your father? Or do you want me to try to call you she only with your father and call you they at other times? And then they told me the answer that they were most comfortable with. Okay, so helping your clients to feel safe. Like I said, we have great opportunity. We can build a network of wonderful professionals around us, whether it's inspectors, contractors, and we can talk to those professionals and support them becoming competent in this as well. Try to find professionals you can work with that are reflective of the whole spectrum of your community. Okay, so we're going to wrap up here. Just want to talk about some resources for learning more. Obviously, we just kind of scratched the surface today. So I encourage you all to learn more. Watch videos and movies about trans and LGBT people. These 5 on the top are great. So Disclosure was a new one that talked about the history of transgender people in film. And these are really fun. Tales of the City, it's a great story. Transparent, that was a great show. Gender Revolution, that's a nonfiction one. So it's a documentary from National Geographic about trans people. And then Pose, a lot of people watching Pose. That show is really, really fun. And then books, wide spectrum of books. If you're curious more about the non-binary identity, that's this one here on the right. This is a new graphic novel written by a non-binary person. Pass with Care. This is written by a trans man, just came out. A lot of people following Janet Mock, a trans woman. This is an old novel about a trans woman that transitioned decades and decades ago. This one is looks like I haven't had a chance to read this one yet, but it looks really fantastic. So thank you all so much for attending the training today. Last slide I'll leave you with is if you want to look at any of those surveys that we went over, that Freddie Mac study that we went over. I believe Eric is going to send this out, so you have an opportunity to find this. Thank you so much.
I will be sending that out. Thank you so much, Percy. This is fantastic. I hope I learned a lot. I saw from the comments that people learned a lot. So thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this with us. It was really helpful and very informative. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy doing these trainings. If anybody wants one of these trainings just for their real estate office, I'd be happy to do this for you, for your office.
Thank you, Percy. I really appreciate that. All right, everyone. And I will send out a follow-up email with Percy's information and his PowerPoint deck. And we will be sharing this, and we will have this in our library of recorded webinars as well. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
And for those still on, we do have the upcoming webinar, Code of Ethics update. We'll be doing a Q&A on that on Thursday. If anybody wanted to know more about that. And we also will be doing a tech talk with the tech helpline. Wow, say that 10 times fast, on December 1st at 9 a.m. Both of those are free. There will be CE for the Code of Ethics update, but not for the tech talk with the tech hotline. All right, thanks so much.